What happens to the architecture of literature when parasocial dynamics start to dictate our taste in fiction? What happens when a consumer is more interested and aggressively invested in connecting with the protagonist rather than, reading the plot and understanding it, leading them to entirely abandon their comprehension of narrative mechanics? The result is a devastating contemporary epidemic, a wave of first-person stories defined by an absolute absence of plot, replaced by this endless self-indulgent internal monologue. We are no longer reading novels or reading stories. We are reading the written equivalent of an influencer broadcasting a lifestyle vlog. The deeper I dive into the mechanics of reading and writing and the entire publishing culture of our current times, the more I analyze it, every single structural failure that exists in this almost always traces back to one singular solitary source: the behavioral habits engineered in us by social media. One of the most insidious sort of mechanics of the digital space is its ability to foster an unbalanced, intensely asymmetric emotional bond between a single creator broadcasting their life, their content out for thousands to see, and the millions of silent observers consuming it on the other side of the screen. We define this phenomena as parasocial relationship. Tragically, this psychological distortion is no longer confined to the social media space, or isn't just prominent in like the contemporary celebrity fandom space. It has completely colonized the literature space, the space of fiction novels. Audiences are no longer sort of engaging with characters as these structural vehicles for theme or plot. Instead, they're consuming the lives of these characters as if these fictional entities were some sort of real world friends to parasocially defend. Today, we are going to interrogate a severe ongoing consequence of this parasocial shift in literature: the weaponization of the first person point of view. Writers are increasingly using this perspective not to advance some sort of complex narrative arc, but to construct a localized text blog. In these stories, the structural focus shifts entirely away from the objective plot mechanics and structural world building onto the focus being what the narrator has to say about things that are happening and about themselves. The collateral damage of this trend is catastrophic. It isn't just that the modern shelf is suddenly sort of buried under monotonous barrage of first-person manuscripts. It is that this practice is executing the death of subtext. Subtext is that the unsaid, the structural friction between what the character is saying and what they're actually doing, and the hidden reality of the world, the in-between of the lines. This is the fundamental element required for critical analytical reading. Without subtext, a novel ceases to be a piece of art and it becomes nothing more than a shallow literal how-to guide. Let's dissect this sort of parasocial destruction of first-person POV. I have actually previously broken down the mechanics of first-person POV and the sudden rise of first-person POV in contemporary, storytelling at the cost of other POVs being sidelined. I did that in my video called "Main Character Syndrome is Human in Literature." In that analysis, I identified the rise of the self-absorbed character dynamics as a primary driver behind the modern surge of first-person narratives. In today's discussion, however, I'm going to pivot away from the POV itself and focus intensely on the stylistic execution of that perspective, as in how it is being used. Because a first-person POV can be used in like a variety of ways. Like you could use it to tell a story. You can use it to have a character tell their personal story in like a autobiography way, or you could have them tell somebody else's story, or the style that is the most dominating in current times, you can use it to execute an endless insular monologue about the plot itself. Now, I deeply appreciate first person POV when it's used to build suspense, thriller, or when it's sort of used in a very witty way, in a way that the narrator is sort of giving some sort of witty, insightful, humorous commentary over what's happening to them. I love that. But I despise when it is abused to turn the narrator into a soapbox orator, halting the plot entirely just to have the narrator deliver this massive multi-page speech regarding just one solitary singular event. When a script behaves this way, it doesn't just slow the narrative down, it fundamentally destroys it. So let us look at some things that this sort of monologue kind of writing can lead to. When a narrator spends far more time inside their head instead of outside in the world, the novel starts to look like a fictional journal. Now, there isn't anything, of course, inherently wrong with that kind of style, except you can't be making the book look like it's going to be plot heavy only to give us like a fictional journal. In place of it, it can be a little misleading. And also, not to mention that this kind of style can suit only certain kind of stories, because stories demand the kind of POV they need. So not all stories, and particularly not all genres, are going to work if they are written in this sort of style. Let's say you want to write a sci-fi fantasy story, and your focus in those kinds of stories is going to be world building. Like without the world building, the stories are going to feel a little empty. And in this kind of style, you cannot do that. This kind of style would be like a death sentence for the story. How can a writer build like this vast, living, socio-political world when the protagonist is like permanently trapped inside their own head? When the camera is sort of focused on the protagonist, when the camera not focused on them but like focused through them, for its focus is on what they see, then everything else that doesn't exist in their immediate vision starts to lose their importance in the story, particularly side characters. Side characters exist in these stories only when they're sort of interacting with the main character. If they're talking to them, interacting with them, that's when they are in their field of vision, and that's when we get to see them. The moment that interaction stops, the main character returns to their mind, returns to their internal world, and the supporting cast completely vanishes. In this framework, the side character is stripped of their autonomy, reduced to these NPCs, non-player characters. They don't possess independent lives or hidden motives or off-screen agency. They exist purely to act as sounding board for the main character's self-reflection. When a character sort of not the character, the writer stalls the plot to sort of accommodate for the internal monologues, or pages upon pages of internal monologues, they sort of run out of things for the character to actually think about. And I've seen that. I've actually read a book where the plot was sidelined to the point that at times the character just kept on repeating the same thoughts over and over with nothing new to say. So let's look at the sort of mathematics of this error. If event A occurs in a story and the character spends sort of like 3 consecutive chapters over analyzing that single event A before moving the plot forward, the script enters this sort of dead zone. Because event B is like still leaks away, the character's thoughts have nothing new or nothing very good to or nothing prominent to anchor themselves in. And to escape this loop, the writer is then forced to sort of into this terrible structure choice. Either they fill those empty pages between event A and event B by repeating the same circular thoughts over and over again, or they abruptly fast forward to the timeline when event B happens, resulting in this very jarring, completely broken pacing rhythm. And of course, the last disaster of this kind of style, when a script over explains microscopic emotional directly to the reader, to the viewer, in the text, it leaves no room, no intellectual room for the reader or the viewer to sort of make conclusions of their own. It doesn't leave any room for them to critically analyze the text and take meaning out of it when meaning is literally being given to them. True subtext requires structural space. Instead of allowing you to sort of analyze the narrative organically, the writer in these kind of monologue style or narration uses the narrator to actually spoon feed you the exact conclusion they want you to reach. They don't leave any room for thought, because what you are thinking is exactly what the narrator is thinking, and so you can't think differently from the narrator. To see this sort of architectural failure in action, we can look at a case study and a brief example. Let's say there's a story about a person, about a narrator who's like on a journey, and this example, both of these examples are written in first person POV to show you that in fact their subtext exists in first person POV if done well. And so we have this narrator who's like on this long, grueling journey, and they have finally arrived at their destination just as the sun begins to set. Let's look at how a true subtext or like good subtext will work. The sun was setting, and I stood watching it sink beneath the jagged silhouettes of the mountains. I let out a long, quiet sigh, a slight smile coming to my face before I pulled myself onto the grass. My eyelids felt heavy, pulling downward with a weight I couldn't fight, and before I could even register the darkness, they closed. Notice that in this particular excerpt, there is no explicit mention of the journey is like being over. Like the narrator isn't like my journey is over or something like that. I'm telling you the journey is over. The reader naturally infers that the setting sun represents the conclusion of the arc and the fading of conflict by comparing the atmospheric shift around the character with the structural state of the plot. The meaning is felt, it's observed, it's read between the lines, not stated. Now look at how this exact scene would be over explained in this parasocial monologue style, completely ruining the exact same subtextual architecture. I had finally arrived at my destination. I was incredibly weary and desperately wanted to lie down somewhere. My body so completely drained of energy that it felt as though it might go entirely limp at any moment. I looked toward the mountains. The sun was setting, and with it, so was my long journey. Just like its fading light, my internal struggles were fading too. Now compare this with the previous previous excerpt. The prose here is definitely, I'd say, okay, clearly written. I wrote it. Clearly written, dynamic, and of course undeniably metaphorical, like sun, setting, fading light, yada yada yada. Yet it possesses zero subtext because the narrator leaves absolutely no room for the reader's imagination. The narrator is explicitly pointing out that the setting sun is connected to their journey ending. Like they are literally saying that with the sun setting, my journey ends too, and with its fading light, my struggles are fading too. the reader then becomes not this active analytical collaborator of the text, but a passive consumer who needs every emotional beat color coded. Like the author is like, hey, look at me, I'm such a genius, the sun is setting, the journey is ending, so make the connection. Yeah, that's not how subtext works. This structural degradation is the undeniable byproduct of parasocial culture, because as consumers we have been conditioned to sort of demand some sort of unhindered access to a character's consciousness. Like, we demand absolute relatability, we demand an immediate synthetic emotional connection. Like, if you look at the discourse surrounding POVs in book, a lot of people say that they like first person POV because it allows them to live inside the character's head, or to harvest an immediate thought, and to bypass the barrier of the page. Like, it's very character focused. Like, they want to connect with the character, they want to follow the character and all of that. But here's the structural reality, okay, that modern it seems that a lot of people don't seem to pay attention to or refuse to acknowledge, is that closed third person narration can also grant you profound access to a character's interiority. The critical difference is that, unlike the first person POV, this kind of prose establishes a formal boundary by utilizing third person pronouns like he, she, they. The text enforces this deliberate aesthetic distance, and that distance is precisely why the modern parasocial driven, and that distance is exactly what these kind of readers fear. Third person narration serves as constant healthy cognitive reminder to the reader that this is like a constructed fictional entity, and you are an external observer processing their narrative arc. You and the protagonist possess no mutual real world relationship. When you're reading a third person narrative, you can clearly see that distance. By reading the words he, she, they, you're like somebody else is telling you a story of someone else, and that distance is what is important. On the other hand, the first person POV hyper-personalizes the text. It functions sort of as an artificial intimacy machine, tricking the reader into feeling as though some sort of real individual is whispering their deepest secrets directly into their ear. It builds an immediate, unearned sense of absolute codependency with the narrator. This is the exact psychological mechanism underpinning the contemporary logging industry. Lifestyle logs in particular, if you have seen any of those, they are meticulously constructed to make the viewer feel as though they are actually participating in some sort of shared journey with the creator, acting as some sort of traveling companion or an intimate confidant. Like, okay, they're carrying the camera around with themselves, and through that camera they're carrying these millions of people around with them. And this illusion is so potent, it routinely convinces the consumer that they possess some sort of exclusive, deeply personal understanding of a creator they have never actually met or are ever actually going to meet. The structural alignment here is absolute. The way a vlogger's camera dynamically follows their movement or captures the world directly through, like, from their eyes, from their perspective, is the precise visual translation of first-person prose. Granted, in a lifestyle video, we do not literally hear the creator's internal monologue or what's inside their head, but I think to compensate for this technical limitation, the influencer must constantly externalize their consciousness, narrating their immediate thoughts, verbalizing their micro opinions, and broadcasting localized commentary on everything within their field of vision. Like, who's going to watch somebody just move their camera around through different places, doing different things without uttering a single word about what they're doing or whatever, completely unrelated? This constant stream of sort of verbalized self-reflection tricks the viewer into believing that they're being trusted with some sort of highly confidential personal data. Like imagine a lifestyle vlogger like about to cook something, and most of the times they'll be like, oh, they will talk about the dish, or maybe they'll talk about how they have tried cooking it before and how that failed, and how they will go into the story of how they failed, and then they will go on something else related to it. This desperate urge to sort of forge a profound one-sided intimacy with an individual or a fictional archetype that is fundamentally incapable of reciprocating that connection is psychologically toxic, okay? Because if it is left unchecked, it takes form of something deeply muddled, delusional parasocial expectation. We see this systemic pathology play out across modern celebrity and idol fandom networks of fandom culture. A massive segment of the digital community, the digital fandom space, will completely spiral into some sort of violent hysteria if their favorite artist were to make a personal professional choice that contradicts the fans' manufactured image of them, reacting with this very bizarre, wounded entitlement of a childhood friend whose trust has been broken. Like, I don't even have to tell you about examples. Like, there are countless examples of that. Like, remember how some fans were literally crazy because Taylor Swift announced her marriage. Now, modern readers are now injecting the same exact parasocial entitlement directly into literature. And of course, here they do not cancel the fictional character if they do not fit their image or something, but something else happens, They approach the page not to analyze a piece of written art, but to consume a character. They want to watch the life of a character, whether they are forming an unhealthy attachment with the narrator themselves, or through the narrator's locked perspective they are obsessing over the romantic lead of the story. The result is identical. The text ceases to be treated as a story and becomes nothing more than this vehicle for digital delusion. Ultimately, the structural consequence of it all, of this parasocial shift, is stark and linear. Subtext is aggressively thrown out of the window, while hyper personalization and systemic over explanation take center stage. The tragedy of this trend is that it is actually conditioning audiences to, passively consume what they are reading or watching. Readers are no longer permitted to intellectually engage with the narrative or the consequences of of it on the real world, the real world implications of the text. They read the text, they register the literal plot points, and they move on. That is the entire life cycle of a modern book. There is like rarely a single lingering instance where the audience is allowed to pause and ask a critical interpretive question. What if the particular instance in the book meant something else entirely? The modern the modern book leaves no room for such inquiry, because the narrator has already preemptively spoon-fed the reader the meaning of the exact meaning of the moment. The author, through the narrator, has already told the reader that this is what the meaning that you must take out of this text. I have extensively analyzed this sort of systemic sanitization of storytelling in my previous video essay, The Death of Nuance, where I focused on the industry's reliance on flat black and white character binaries. And here the psychological threads tie together perfectly. When your primary motto is to form this sort of synthetic protective bond with a fictional character, you will naturally refuse to acknowledge their moral failures. It mirrors the exact, pathology of real-world parasocial fans who will aggressively defend a celebrity against objective accountability, as if their own identity is dependent on it, as if their favorite celebrity turns out to be somebody wrong, that they will go crazy in trying to defend it, because as if that's going to personally impact them in some way. Only hypocritically to instantly turn on that exact artist the moment they break the manufactured illusion the fans have created about them. Similarly, if a fictional protagonist fails to remain flawless, perfectly validated entity, or the reader imagined them to be, the audience rejects the text entirely. They cling fiercely to their self-insert headcanons, demanding that their personal interpretation to be treated as this absolute unshakable truth. It's also wild. Sometimes people actually defend fictional characters in regards to their actions as if they were real people that needed defending. As authors and creators, it's time to reclaim the agency of our craft. Like, we must establish a firm, uncompromising boundary line for the audience, irrespective of the POV you're using for your story, okay? This is the story of an engineered fictional individual who does not exist, and it demands to be respected on its own artistic terms. You, as a reader, like we as a readers, do not possess some sort of inherent right to live inside a character's skull. It's like wanting to follow every single human out there. Let there be space. Let there be structural empty space within the prose. Let there be layers of psychological ambiguity. A reader shouldn't and doesn't need to know protagonists from head to toe like they have lived through life with them, nor should they be able to mathematically sort of mentally predict their exact behavioral response to sort of every microscopic conflict in the plot. That unpredictable, almost chaotic friction is vital to the realistic human drama that fiction often portrays. The preservation of character ambiguity is an essential column of subtext, and by flattening it to appease an algorithm, we are destroying the very soul of the novel. If you enjoyed this breakdown, please take a moment to subscribe to my channel, check out some of the other videos on my channel too, and of course, if you are like a like a aspiring author or just a person deeply interested in the craft of writing, you should check out my Substack called Knights of Pendum, where I pull back the curtains on trope mechanics and narrative designs. Thank you for being with me today. I'll see you in the next one. Until then, keep theorizing.